A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. Juliet Smith from our sister station in Eugene spoke with one of the professors to learn more.
Imagine standing in a dry cave in the high desert of south-central Oregon. Dust hangs quietly in the air as archaeologists brush away layer after layer of earth, expecting to find little more than the ordinary traces of ancient life. Then, buried deep beneath the cave floor, they uncover something that should not exist. At first, nobody believes what they are seeing. The discovery is carefully packed and sent to a laboratory. Days later, the results arrive, and the age makes no sense. Certain that a mistake has been made, the researchers collect another sample and send it to a different laboratory. The second test comes back with the same answer. A third analysis is performed using another sample, and once again the numbers refuse to change. Every result points to the same astonishing conclusion. Whoever left these remains had stood on American soil thousands of years before history claimed the first humans ever arrived. In that moment, the story archaeologists had trusted for generations begins to unravel. But before we uncover what was found inside this mysterious cave, and why it forced scientists to rethink the earliest chapters of human history, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Now, let's step back in time to one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever made in North America. For most of the 20th century, the history of the first Americans seemed settled. Textbooks confidently told the same story. According to that story, the first people to enter North America were the Clovis people, named after discoveries near Clovis, New Mexico, where beautifully crafted fluted stone spear points were uncovered. These hunters were believed to have crossed the frozen land bridge connecting Asia and Alaska around 13,000 years ago, before moving south through an ice-free corridor and spreading across the continent. Their distinctive stone technology became the defining signature of the earliest Americans, and for decades the Clovis timeline stood almost beyond question. The evidence appeared to support it. There was no securely dated evidence of tobacco use in prehistoric America earlier than roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, and nothing seemed capable of pushing human occupation significantly further back. The timeline appeared complete. Case closed. Scientists built careers defending it. Documentary filmmakers repeated it. Students memorized it. Few people imagined that one forgotten cave in Oregon would force the entire narrative to be reconsidered. That cave was known as Paisley Caves. Researchers had visited the site for years, but nobody had examined it deeply enough to realize what had been preserved beneath its floor. When archaeologists finally began excavating carefully through the ancient layers, they were not greeted by spectacular treasures or remarkable weapons. Instead, they found something surprisingly ordinary: preserved human waste. Thousands of years earlier, someone had left it on the cave floor, and the cave's exceptionally dry climate had preserved it almost perfectly. What looked like an insignificant lump of ancient organic material soon became one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made in North America. Unlike stone tools, these remains contained something far more personal: human DNA. Scientists extracted mitochondrial DNA from the preserved material and sequenced it with extraordinary care. The genetic signatures belong to the Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2. These were not the remains of some mysterious population that disappeared without descendants. They represented the direct ancestors of indigenous peoples living in the Americas today, people whose family histories stretch back across thousands of years to a cave that most of the world had never even heard of. Then came the dating. Using accelerator mass spectrometry, a technique capable of directly measuring the age of organic material without relying on the surrounding soil or nearby objects. Researchers determined the age of the samples. The results exceeded 14,000 years before present. That placed the Paisley Cave occupants at least 1,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have entered North America. Suddenly, one uncomfortable possibility became impossible to ignore. The Clovis people had not been the first Americans, yet even this remarkable discovery was not the true beginning of the story. Paisley Caves simply became the moment when decades of growing evidence could no longer be ignored. Years before anyone focused on Oregon, another quiet discovery had already challenged the accepted timeline. Far to the east, in western Pennsylvania, stood Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, a sandstone overhang overlooking a small stream about 7 miles upstream from the Ohio River. Its broad stone ceiling created natural protection from wind and rain, making it exactly the sort of place prehistoric travelers would have chosen for shelter. One archaeologist would later describe it as possessing all the comforts of a prehistoric holiday destination. For centuries, the shelter sat unnoticed. Then, in 1955, local historian Albert Miller reached into a groundhog burrow on the property and pulled out a handful of dirt containing artifacts that immediately caught his attention. Those unexpected objects hinted that something extraordinary lay buried beneath the shelter floor. Serious archaeological excavation finally began in 1973. At that time, researchers believed they already understood the story of the first people in the New World. The Clovis model dominated archaeological thinking, and few expected the excavation to challenge it. Jim Adovasio, leading the project, carefully removed the soil one layer at a time. With every layer he uncovered, the evidence grew older. Eventually, radiocarbon dating produced results that stunned the research team. Humans had occupied Meadowcroft between approximately 16,000 and 19,000 calibrated calendar years ago. If those dates were correct, then people had reached North America thousands of years before the accepted Clovis timeline. A single cave in Oregon had challenged the story. Now, a rock shelter in Pennsylvania suggested that challenge might only be the beginning. When Jim Adovasio published his findings in the journal American Antiquity in July 1980, he knew they would attract attention. His excavations at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter suggested that people may have occupied the site between roughly 16,000 and 19,000 years ago, significantly earlier than the timeline favored by the widely accepted Clovis first model. The reaction was immediate. Some researchers questioned whether the radiocarbon samples had been contaminated. Others remained unconvinced that the evidence was strong enough to overturn decades of archaeological thinking. For many scientists, the Clovis model had become the foundation of North American prehistory, and changing that foundation would require extraordinary evidence. As the debate continued, some archaeologists began referring to the resistance as Clovis primacy syndrome, arguing that the attachment to the traditional model had become difficult to separate from the evidence itself. Others believed the skepticism was simply part of the normal scientific process, where extraordinary claims demand careful scrutiny. Even decades later, consensus remained elusive. Surveys of archaeologists showed that some accepted Meadowcroft's early dates. Many remained uncertain, and others continued to reject them altogether. Then another discovery entered the conversation. When evidence emerged from Oregon's Paisley Caves, it did not stand alone. Instead, it joined a growing collection of sites that suggested the story of the first Americans might be more complicated than once believed. Whether Paisley settled the debate or simply strengthened one side of it depended on whom you asked, but few archaeologists could ignore it. Yet the surprises were far from over. Roughly 70 miles from Paisley Caves, near the small community of Riley in Oregon's Harney County, another quiet excavation was unfolding at a place called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Since 2011, University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady and his team had been carefully excavating the site. At first, the discoveries seemed modest. A few obsidian flakes, a groundstone tool, scattered artifacts that hinted people had once camped there. But archaeology often rewards patience rather than spectacle. Layer by layer, the site began revealing a much older story. Unlike Paisley Caves, Rimrock Draw offered no preserved human DNA. Instead, it preserved something equally valuable, a geological timeline locked into the earth itself. Buried within the sediments lay a thin band of white volcanic ash. Scientists identified it as ash from a known eruption of Mount St. Helens that occurred approximately 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. That ash served as a natural timestamp. Anything above it had to be younger, anything below it had to be older. As excavations continued beneath the ash, the team recovered 27 tiny fragments of fossilized tooth enamel. One belonged to an extinct camel species that once lived in North America during the last ice age. Another came from Bison antiquus, a large ancestor of today's American bison. Finding Ice Age animals was not surprising. Finding them beneath the volcanic ash simply confirmed they had lived before that eruption. Then the excavation produced something more intriguing. Resting in the same ancient layer was a stone tool made from orange chalcedony, a glassy variety of agate. It was unlike a simple flake. Its edges told a story of repeated use. One side had been shaped for cutting, another for scraping. A third carried small worn teeth that suggested heavy, prolonged use. Years later, Patrick O'Grady compared it to an early Swiss army knife because a single tool appeared to have served multiple purposes. Its worn surfaces suggested it had been carried, sharpened, used, reshaped, and used again over a long period of time before finally being left behind. Its position within the site made it especially interesting. The tool lay roughly 10 centimeters beneath the camel tooth fragments. If the surrounding layers had remained undisturbed, that meant the tool had been deposited before the animal remains above it. To understand the sequence better, researchers dated the fossil teeth. The laboratory analyzed the samples, then repeated the tests independently. Both results pointed to approximately 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. O'Grady later recalled how surprising those results were. He explained that finding a single date that old was exciting but also unsettling because extraordinary dates require equally strong supporting evidence. Receiving two independent results that agreed with one another gave the team greater confidence that the dates deserved serious consideration. Taken together, the volcanic ash, the Ice Age animal remains, and the stone tool suggested that humans may have been present at Rimrock Draw considerably earlier than the traditional Clovis timeline would predict. Exactly what that means and how it fits into the broader story of the first Americans remains an active area of archaeological research. The discoveries at Rimrock Draw did more than push back a timeline. They introduced an entirely different kind of story. As archaeologists carefully examined the stone tools, they realized they did not belong to the famous Clovis tradition that had dominated discussions of the first Americans for decades. Instead, the tools fit into a different archaeological tradition known as the Western stemmed tradition. They were shaped differently. Their blades were long and narrow, their shoulders were weak. Their bases were rounded rather than fluted. To an archaeologist, the difference was immediately obvious. These were not Clovis points made by Clovis craftsmen. They represented another technology, another tradition, possibly another population altogether. Archaeologists continue to debate exactly how these toolmakers fit into the peopling of the Americas. But one thing was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. If the dating at sites like Rimrock Draw was correct, then these tools existed thousands of years before the classic Clovis culture appeared. The story of the first Americans was no longer a straight line. It was becoming a web. And Oregon was only one chapter. Nearly 700 miles to the south, another discovery was waiting beneath a landscape so unusual that few people imagined it could preserve one of the most remarkable records of ancient human life ever found. Stretching across southern New Mexico lies White Sands National Park, a place where endless white gypsum dunes shimmer beneath the desert sun. Today, it looks almost otherworldly. But thousands of years ago, the landscape was very different. A vast Ice Age lake, known as Lake Otero, once covered much of the area. When the lake disappeared, it left behind broad mudflats that slowly hardened beneath the desert sky. In 2009, researchers walking across those ancient lake beds noticed shallow impressions pressed into the gypsum surface. At first, they seemed insignificant. Then, they looked closer. They were footprints, human footprints, not one, not two, dozens of them. Eventually, researchers documented 61 fossilized tracks preserved with astonishing detail. Individual toes could still be seen. The arches of feet remained visible. Some prints belonged to children with tiny feet. Others appeared to have been left by adults moving quickly across the soft ground, perhaps even running. For a brief moment in the distant past, families had crossed the muddy shoreline of Lake Otero. Then the mud dried, wind buried the tracks, and they remained hidden for thousands of years until modern scientists happened to walk across them. Finding the footprints was extraordinary. Determining their age proved even more remarkable. In 2021, researchers dated seeds of spiral ditchgrass recovered from the same sediment layers as the footprints. Radiocarbon analysis suggested the tracks were between approximately 21,000 and 23,000 years old. If those dates were correct, humans had been walking across New Mexico during the height of the last glacial maximum, long before the traditional Clovis timeline. Not everyone accepted the conclusion. Critics argued that aquatic plants can sometimes absorb ancient carbon dissolved in groundwater, potentially making radiocarbon dates appear older than the true age of the sediments. It was a reasonable scientific question. Rather than relying on a single line of evidence, researchers turned to another. This time, they examined fossilized conifer pollen preserved within the same sediment layers. Because the pollen came directly from trees growing at the time, it would not be affected by groundwater carbon in the same way. When the new analyses were completed, they pointed to essentially the same age range. The evidence continued to support an age of roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years. Then, another study added yet another piece to the puzzle. Published in Science Advances in 2025, researchers analyzed organic material recovered from wetland mud and shallow lake sediments associated with the footprints. 3 different sources, 3 independent dating approaches: seeds, pollen, organic mud. Each pointed toward the same general period during the height of the last ice age. The footprints themselves made the scene even more remarkable. They did not cross the ancient shoreline alone. Preserved in the same layers were the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous Ice Age mammals that disappeared from North America thousands of years ago. For a brief moment in prehistory, humans and these extinct giants had crossed the same muddy landscape. Their footprints remained together long after the animals and the people were gone. For archaeologists, White Sands quickly became one of the most important sites ever discovered in North America. Yet even as researchers debated its implications, another discovery in Southern California promised an even greater mystery. Unlike White Sands, this discovery was never planned. No one was searching for evidence of ancient humans. No one expected to rewrite anything. It began with a routine freeway construction project. Heavy machinery carved through layers of earth as workers prepared the ground. Then, without warning, the metal blade struck something solid. The machine stopped instantly. The foreman climbed down to investigate. At first glance, the object seemed ordinary enough. Perhaps a buried rock, maybe an old section of pipe. But as loose soil was brushed away, its curved shape became unmistakable. It was bone, not just any bone. The remains of something that had been alive thousands of years before the first roads, the first cities, or the first written history. Construction stopped immediately. Paleontologists were called to the site, unaware that the excavation they were about to begin would become one of the most controversial discoveries in American archaeology. When paleontologists arrived at the construction site in Southern California, they expected to recover the remains of an Ice Age animal. What they did not expect was a mystery. Carefully, the team exposed the skeleton buried beneath the soil. The bones belonged to a single mastodon, an elephant-like relative that had lived during the Ice Age before eventually disappearing from North America. At first, the discovery seemed straightforward. Then the bones began telling a different story. They were not simply scattered by time or erosion. Many of them displayed spiral fractures, a pattern that typically forms when fresh bone is struck with great force. Dry, fossilized bone usually shatters into jagged pieces. Fresh bone behaves differently. It twists as it breaks. To some members of the research team, the pattern suggested deliberate breakage, perhaps to expose the nutrient-rich marrow inside, a resource known to have been valued by prehistoric humans. The surprises did not end there. Mixed among the bones were 5 large rounded cobbles. They did not appear to belong naturally within the surrounding sediments. Geological analysis indicated they were unlikely to have been transported to the site by flowing water. The researchers proposed that the stones may have been carried there and used as hammerstones and anvils before being left behind. If that interpretation was correct, someone, or something capable of using stone tools, had once stood beside the mastodon. The next question was even more startling. How old was the site? Using uranium-thorium dating, researchers analyzed the mastodon remains. The results consistently pointed to an age of approximately 130,700 years. If both the dating and the interpretation of the broken bones were correct, the implications would be extraordinary. In 2017, the research team, Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Demarais, and Richard Fulligar, published their findings in Nature. They proposed that an unidentified hominin may have been present in North America around 130,700 years ago. The claim immediately became one of the most debated ideas in modern archaeology. Many researchers questioned whether the fractured bones truly resulted from hominin activity. Others suggested natural geological processes or heavy construction equipment could potentially explain at least some of the damage. While the age of the mastodon itself has generally not been the central point of disagreement, the interpretation that a hominin intentionally modified the bones remains highly controversial. Today, the Cerutti Mastodon site continues to be discussed and debated rather than widely accepted as evidence of such an early human presence.